Hello. Thank you so much for being with us. Whether you're watching live right now or sometime in the future, we are extremely glad that you're here. My name is Aidan Flax Clark, and I'm coming to you from the New York Public Library, where I put together Live from NYPL. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing tonight's event featuring New York Times bestselling author, educator, artist, and abolitionist Patrisse Cullors. She's here to talk about her new book, An Abolitionist Handbook, 12 Steps to Changing Yourself and the World. And she's joined for that conversation by fellow New York Times bestselling author, Frederick Joseph. For those of you who are curious, Patrisse and Frederick's full bios can be found on the event listing, where you are hopefully also watching this right now. And on that page, we are also glad to share with you links to purchase or check out Patrisse's book, as well as links to check out some amazing additional reading that Patrisse has recommended for after you read An Abolitionist Handbook. The link to purchase her book, which we're hopefully also sharing in the chat right now, will point you toward buying it from our own library shop, which of course I would argue is the best bookstore that you can buy this fantastic book from. And proceeds from your purchase go to benefit the New York Public Library. But if you would rather borrow it, we will be very glad to lend it to you. All you need is a valid New York Public Library card, which obviously everyone who's watching who lives in New York already has. But just in case, you can also find a link on the event page for how to get a card. Patrisse is, of course, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, so it feels appropriate to present this event here with you at the beginning of Black History Month. Since Black history is American history, though, I like the motto that our sister library, the Schomburg Center, has, which is that every month is Black History Month. But we are very glad to be taking part in the library's official Black History Month celebrations, which include a lot of free events like this, but also free programs for adults and teens. The new exhibit at the Schomburg, which is called Boundless, 10 Years of Seeding Black Comic Futures, and the Black Liberation Reading List, and much, much more. So to see everything that's happening this month, you can go to nypl.org/Black History Month, which is all one word. Okay, quickly before we get to the conversation, I would love to tell you about some other Live from NYPL events that we have coming up. Tomorrow night, Poet Laureate and Library Lion Rita Dove joins Glory Edom, the founder of Well Read Black Girl, and they will speak with scholar and critic Salamisha Tillett. Next week, award-winning culture writer Dan Charnas talks about his new book, Dilla Time, the first biography of the legendary hip-hop producer Jay Dilla, and he speaks with pianist and composer Jason Moran. And later in the month, we are very excited to, at long last, invite you back into our physical space for Live from NYPL in-person events, the first in almost 2 years. Starting February 28th, Live from NYPL will return to our Midtown campus at 5th Avenue and 40th Street, and we will kick off a full season of in-person programming. Very first event will be February 28th, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Timothy Snyder. After that, we have Skip Gates on March 10th and many more. So to learn more and to register, go to nypl.org/live. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, as well as the Margaret and Herman Sokol Public Education Endowment Fund and the support of library patrons and friends. Okay, so thank you very much for being with us. Let's welcome Frederick Joseph and Patrisse Cullors.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? Patrisse, this is really something I've been looking forward to like for days, and as soon as I got the question of whether I was interested in doing this, I jumped at the opportunity because I first, before we get into your book, want to just say thank you for the work that you've done. In my debut book, I actually used your work, and just your name so many times shows up in my own work. So to sit here with you now, talking about your work and your newest book is truly an honor and a pleasure. So
thank you.
Truly. So before we get into your book, right? I got your book. I literally engulfed it in just about a day. But before we get into that work, and before we get into the publishing work that you've done, I want to talk about who Patrisse is, right? Because something came to mind as I was reading this book, something came to mind as I was reading your first book and just watching some of your interviews. There's this idea that a person who has such public interest, global public interest that you have, in some ways no longer gets to be a human in certain people's eyes, right? And I don't think a lot of people realize that, because it's rare that people, do the things that you have done, right?
Yeah.
But there's this global narrative about who you are. So
Yeah.
what I want to know, to set the stage before we talk about the book, is who is Patrisse outside of one of the founders of BLM and New York Times bestselling author? Who are you as a person, and what else are you working on?
I love that question. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for just starting there. For me, so many different ways that I would just describe like who I am as a human being. One, I'm a really sensitive human being. I think it's why I end up in the work that I'm in. I love us so much. I love Black folks so much. I really often dream of the day we really feel full liberation and freedom. And I'm also an artist. I feel like at my core, that's what I am, as an artist, as a creative. And I've been that way as long as I can remember. And I'm a mom. Many people don't know that. I don't post my child on social. I don't talk about my child very much for security reasons, but that's a huge part of my life, huge part of my world, is raising the next generation, raising the next human being who I'm hoping that I can create enough of a path that their world is not as impacted by racism and sexism and patriarchy as my world has been, our world has been. And I'm a dreamer, I'm a big optimist. I really truly feel like when there's a will, there's a way. I'm a person who really believes that we create and shape our conditions, and sometimes it's very, very hard work, but that at the end of the day, we really make the choice around what our world look like.
It was so obvious to me, not just in this book, but in both your books, that humanity that I just asked about, right? Like it was obvious to me that this person has to be a parent. It was obvious to me that this person is a partner. It's obvious to me that this person is a daughter, and so on and so forth, because there's a tenderness in your writing, right? And there's a tenderness in your abolition work. And I think that tenderness is at the center of something I heard you say recently, when you said that abolition is how we show up for each other. And before we dive into an abolitionist handbook, I want you to define abolition from your purview, right? Because I think that there's always false narratives and ideas of what abolition means. What does abolition mean to you? How do you define that word?
It's simple. It's a simple definition that I give, which is abolition is the getting rid of police, prisons, jails, detention centers, court surveillance as we know it. But also, abolition is about what we dream of and imagine and build out. Ruth Gilmore, who writes about abolition extensively, talks about how abolition is not just what we get rid of, but it's also what we create, what we build. As abolitionists, we're not in the business of just getting rid of systems, but we're also in the business of building out new systems, new visions for this world, for this place, for our families and for our communities.
Understood. So, okay, let's dive into the book now, because like I said, I read the book in one day, and then I went back yesterday and basically read the book entirely again, right? So let's dive into it. Why this book right now, right?
Yeah.
Like abolition is, I would say that abolition in many ways is hitting the mainstream conversation, the cultural zeitgeist, if you would. Yes. What do you hope that this book adds? And again, why this book right now?
You know, this book right now has everything to do with what is, I believe, necessary to build a new world. I'm not the only abolitionist. I'm not the only person who's written about abolition, thank goodness. But I decided to write like a kind of handbook because I thought it was important to have a conversation about how we become abolitionists. What's the practice of an abolitionist? What does it take inside of us as we are in relationship to other human beings and other systems? Abolition and the work of abolition is not just something that exists outside of us. It's something that also exists inside of us. And so I really wanted to take the reader through both my own experiences, other experiences that I've witnessed, as well as taking the reader through like who else is doing the work. As you see, I highlight other abolitionists who are knee deep in their journey. I also, give readers guidance around where else you can learn and practice. Abolition is not something that you just consume and read about, but it's something that you're practicing on a daily basis. In some ways, I really do model it, off of like a self-help model. But I see it as like a part of a radical liberatory model around who we are as human beings. So this book is really, it's an offering. It's an offering to the current abolitionist framework.
One of the things I loved about the book is how accessible it is, right? A lot of my writing is in the young adult space, and I take pride in that because I love that, kids 12, 13, 14 can dive into these concepts in ways that inform them for the rest of their lives. And I actually think that you did that here, and you did it in such a way that it's easy to digest. One of the most important parts of the book that jumps out to me was the idea of saying yes to imagination. And it was one of the first things that you mentioned. Can you just describe that more? Like, why is imagination so important to you as both an author, activist, and artist? And how does that inform your work in this book?
Absolutely. I talk about imagination a lot. I feel like a lot of Black folks do, a lot of Black scholars, organizers, educators, abolitionists, artists. Imagination is such a central part of play, and play is such a central part of how we evolve and how we connect to ourselves and each other. I believe that one of the great sacrifices of living inside of a white supremacist patriarchal system is the way in which it's stolen our imagination, how it has impacted our ability to imagine something different, something wholly different than what we currently exist in. So I'm very interested in the imagination as a tool to practice something new, to imagine something new. I'm really calling for us to use our imagination to see what else would we do if we didn't have police in prisons, and do it as an exercise, right? Just because we imagine it doesn't mean that it exists right, it's going to happen right away. Lots of people are scared of abolition or the term abolition. And so I often try to really get people to imagine, okay, hold on. Let's just start with our imagination. Like, let's use that. We have it for a reason. And from there, what I often find is people kind of understanding, oh, there are so many other ways that we can handle so many things that in this country in particular that currently involve the police and prison state.
Yeah, I think that was another thing that was super powerful about this book is there's not an ellipses after everything that you say. Instead, you actually lead people to a place, right? Like every single chapter, you end the chapter or have within the chapter people to learn from, ways in which this is being applied already. And I think that one of the most powerful things that you do is actually speak to accountability, right? And you speak to accountability not just about the systems, right? You speak to accountability about the people within the systems, including yourself, which I was very surprised by, quite frankly, right? Like, I think that the most powerful thing that a writer, activist, educator can do is take inventory and stock on a regular basis so that they can be better. Because that's the only way that you can ask other people to be better. So how does accountability, right? Because there's you, again, in this book, you're really honest, right? Like, very similar to your last book, you're just very direct, like, hey, I need to grow and change. So how does accountability inform who you are, the work that you're doing, and like, why is that so important to just abolition work as a whole?
Sure. I mean, accountability is a muscle that I would argue many of us in this country don't use often. Accountability is often scary for people. And we are taught that the way we hold people accountable is by punishing them. And by treating them poorly, or when you make a mistake, when you've made a mistake, that mistake must be reprimanded in a way that often cost us our dignity. And so I believe, and many of us believe, that accountability can happen in connection and in community. And that accountability isn't always someone telling you to be accountable, but actually, how are we accountable first? How do I hold myself accountable for actions, harm I've caused? And what does that look like? But also, because we live in an environment that doesn't practice a kind of accountability, centered accountability, I get that term from generative somatics, because we don't practice centered accountability often, when someone is centered and accountable, it's sometimes hard for us to see that as accountability, right? Sometimes we can't even, oh wait, someone's apologizing. If you've never been apologized to, if you've never seen accountability or felt it, it could be really confusing on the system. Like, oh, I don't know how to relate to this, and you could still be ramping up and being upset with someone. So I think accountability goes both ways. It's both, learning how to be accountable, but also, when you get accountability, learning how to receive it, which, goes to my chapter around forgiving actively, not passively. And I think those things are really important. I'm truly asking us and myself to unlearn the culture that we've been acculturated in, which I call a carceral culture, the culture of punishment, revenge, punitive ways of being, and learn a new way, because, we are witnessing, especially I would say in these last 2.5 years, how much we are suffering under the pandemic, under the former government, under this current government. There's so much suffering, and that takes a toll on us, takes a toll on how we treat ourselves and each other. And I really do believe abolition can give us a new pathway, a new belief system on how we show up for each other.
I love that. And one of the things I was looking to see when I went into this book, especially as someone who, I call myself an abolitionist in process, right? I call myself a feminist in process, an intersectional feminist specifically, and all these different things, because it allows me to see that I still have a place to go. I still have learning to do, right? And I think that we all do. And when I came to your book, I was like, okay, how is she going to reconcile the fact that, in a capitalistic, white, patriarchal country, our dynamism has been erased, right? Like, even I've watched as your dynamism, quite frankly, has been erased in the media. I've watched as, people have attacked you, and just reading you, I'm like, oh, this is not true, right? I can like literally read your words for 10 minutes. And I'm like, oh, this is absolutely not true. So one of the questions I want to ask you is, understanding and having, again, the rare instance of the heights that you've climbed to in your work, how have you changed in this book since your last book? Because because there's so much there that has changed, and it's obvious how much more dynamic you even are now.
Yeah, such a good question. I wrote this book, I started writing it in 2019, and I was really interested in writing it really, for our movement to learn new skills. That's who I was writing it for. That was my audience. And then as I continued to write, I was like, oh, this can be useful for anybody and everybody. But also, you know, I didn't realize that in many ways that I would become such a attacked figure. That so much of what I had done would have tried to be erased and revisionist history. And so I've used these values so much more these last 2 years, more than I ever thought I would imagine. I wrote this book, I look back and I was actually re-listening to it on the audiobook. I wrote this book for me too. I wrote this book for what I wouldn't realize would be a future Patrisse that would be under extreme pressure and extreme scrutiny. And I believe these values have both like saved my sanity, but also have given me great direction in this time. And I know, much of what I'm experiencing is part of a legacy of what people who have fought for Black freedom have experienced for a long time. Black people don't get to make mistakes. And the mistakes we make are used against us often. And also we're just lied on, just straight up lies. Like folks lie on us on purpose to discredit us. So I think, I've changed so much. I've really been, I don't like the word tested. I don't like that word, but I feel like it. I feel that way. I feel like my sanity has been tested, my integrity, what I believe in. And at the end of the day, after everything that has happened, it's just made me even more of a believer of abolition, truly, and like why it's such a critical framework.
Yeah, I think that that's beautiful, and it's something that jumped off the page. Quite frankly, I think the love, passion, humanity that you have, not just for the world around you, but for yourself. Because I think that oftentimes what gets lost in not just the work of abolition, but the work of combating all these carceral systems that you mentioned, right? Like all these systems of oppression, is that when you're doing this work, it's actually for yourself. It's actually self-care to do the work, right? It's you're making an investment in your child. You're making an investment in the generations that are coming, and again, that just jumps off the page, and I love that. So one of the things I want to ask you is, I was thinking like, oh my God, I wish I had this book 3 years ago, because if I had this book 3 years ago, I wouldn't have made some of the mistakes that I made. So what parts of the book, for the people who are going to have this handbook and carry it around, as you've told us to do in the book, right? Like, this is not something that you want placed on the shelf. It's not something that you want people to read and get through. What parts of this deeply human, deeply reflective, deeply progressive and imaginative work do you want people to come back to most often when they are pulling it out their back pocket?
That's a very good question. I'm looking down at the book right now, and I'm going straight to the table of contents. I'll say like the top 3 chapters for me that feel like important, especially in this time, is number 1, courageous conversations, digging into that practice of having the courage to know that a courageous conversation is necessary as we're in connection as human beings. I think the imagination chapter, saying yes to our imagination. And I would also say number 10, which is build community. I truly believe that you know, especially during this pandemic, right? Like you start to, our circles got so small, right? Like so small. It was like, okay, you know, whoever was in the group chat, like that's who we were talking to. Like, and then once you realize like, okay, we could see some of our friends, like who is it going to be? Who's the safest? Who can you trust? And I really think that practice of building community is so important. I think about the people who spent a lot of the pandemic, the quarantine in particular, alone. You know, those first few months where people were like in their homes and couldn't leave, and they were by themselves, and what community means and what it feels like. Also, community is there for you in the most joyous moments and the hardest moments. And as I've gone through this last couple years, I've thought, you know, I've really come to the conclusion for me that my community is my top priority. And I include my blood family in that, like the people who see me, who know me, who understand me, who I can be, you know, in close relationship to, who I can take care of. Like those my people are important to me. And I think that means a lot.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I noticed, and I actually just started writing names down, because I think that sometimes when people do certain types of work, right, people assume that everyone knows each other, right? Like people are like, you've never met Patrisse in person? I'm like, no, Patrisse and I have never hung out, right? Like I'm just like, and there's this assumption that everybody knows everyone. And that's one of the things I enjoyed about the book, is that I found myself just jotting all these names down of people you were mentioning, just doing amazing work in your direct community, right?
Yes.
And I think that if for nothing else, everyone who picks this book up will be better for the people you've also introduced them to.
Yeah.
Right? And I appreciated that, because you don't just name names, you also gave flowers, right? You gave flowers to people you learned from. You gave flowers to people who have guided you and helped you and lifted you and so on and so forth. And that speaks to one of the pillars of the book, just being not just community, but specifically interpersonal relationships that you've discussed, right? So my question for you is, and I just watched you, we mentioned before we got on this, that you were talking to Angela Davis just recently, rather, and I know how much you love her. But who else has poured into you? Who else do you want to give flowers for who you are right now at this moment?
I love that. My mom's been such a critical guide for me, just so accountable to me and my healing. You know, really like folks who are in my comrade group, right? Like Prentice Hemphill and Adrienne Maree Brown, who both intro to the book, and just incredible, amazing human beings. And there's so many other movement elders that have poured into me. I have to say, you know, Melina Abdullah, who's here in LA, who's been such I acknowledged her at the end of this book, thanked her for just believing in me and seeing my vision and loving on me. So yeah, I think that's the team.
Gotcha. So there's a question that I have personally, right? Like, so I just right at this moment, I have to be a Patrisse mentee, if you would, right? So there's a question I have for you that it doesn't really matter to me if no one else wants to hear the answer to this. So, you know, as an abolitionist, you know, understanding that Blackness is not a monolith, right? Understanding that no group is monolithic, you're going to have people in your own community, broad community, right? Who don't agree with you, right? There are people who are reformists, and people are going to say, well, they're Black, you're abolitionist, they're reformist. How do you reconcile that, right? Like, how do you reconcile people with large platforms, people who are activists and authors and you know, public intellectuals who are just like, I don't believe in abolition? And how does your book play into that?
Oh, it's a good question. You know, I do think that there are more abolitionists that are just in need of understanding what it means. There's a lot of obviously misinformation, disinformation about abolition and what we're talking about as modern day abolitionists. But I also think it's a journey. It truly is a journey, an abolitionist journey. And it takes time to unlearn, and it takes time to make a decision that, like, yeah, I don't want to see the police. I don't want to see prisons, especially when there's such a fixture in our lives. And I do believe that most people, if really dug into the concept of abolition and what abolitionists want and desire, I do believe most people would say that's actually what I want and desire too. And the reality is that people are going to have to accept that the police and prison state as we know it is actually antithetical to abolition. It's antithetical to human dignity. And we're going to have to understand that as a society. There was a time where people did not believe we can get rid of slavery, where it was such a part of the American fabric. It was in the DNA of this country. And there was a time where it was ludicrous that the idea that we would stop enslaving human beings. And we did for the most part. Obviously, the 13th Amendment happened. And so, right, slavery was abolished, but unless you committed a crime. So what we're still in the vestiges of slavery. We did not get rid of it all the way. This is still, as Angela Davis says, it's still an anti-slavery movement. And we should see ourselves as part of a legacy of trying to fully free Black people. And I argue all of us. If a group of people are not free and you live in the same country with them, you're not free either. And so we have to work towards that.
You know, it's such a powerful sentiment, right? This idea that we've done the hard things before, right? We've had to imagine something and push forward in spite of things being woven into the very fabric of what this nation stands for. And you mentioned slavery, and I think about that with student loan debt cancellation. I think of that with the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, so on and so forth. And because I think that one of the primary critiques of abolition is oftentimes what comes next, right? So I want to ask you that from your perspective, what do you want to see come next? And that can be in regards to anything specific to federal law, specific to your immediate community. What are some of the things you want to see come next?
Well, I actually want to shout out work that's happening that I feel like is future abolition work. One, Soulfire Farm in upstate New York. It's a Black farming community. They are doing amazing work at using their land and farming to train other Black people, but also to feed people in their community. That's abolitionist work that's happening right now. I think about the team of people who is a part of Where Is My Land? The Where Is My Land co-founders are fighting for Black people to get their land back, including the fight to win Bruce's Beach, which was land taken from a Black family in Southern California and Manhattan Beach. They just fought and won to get that land back. These are things that are happening right now that are abolitionist work. Here in Los Angeles, in my hometown, communities of people who have stopped the building of two $3.5 billion jails, and now working to implement full mental health care in Los Angeles, working to implement getting people access to food, housing. That is all abolitionist work, and that's work that we should be lifting up and supporting every day.
I love that. You know, one of my favorite things that I learned in grad school studying marketing was if you get one person to show up for an event, you can get 1 million people to show up for an event, right? And that is, it just seems like that energy, you have it in this book, right? Like you firmly believe that every single person who reads this book can truly be an abolitionist and then help someone else become an abolitionist and so on and so forth. But that takes energy, right? Like that legitimately takes energy to do what you're doing, to do what you've done. I just, in transparency, I've watched Patrisse as people have just created all sorts of narratives about who Patrisse is and what Patrisse is. So where do you find the energy, right? Because we're all thankful for it, but where do you find it?
You know, it goes back to my team, my community, my family. I really find it in them, but I also find it in our ancestors. I think about Ida B. Wells, who I talk about in the book. I think about so many ancestors. You know, but I think by the time Ida B. passed, those last few years, she was really done dirty by the media. She was done dirty by, you know, her fellow comrades, and but her work is in this legacy. You know, we are part of that legacy of anti-lynching work. And I find it in folks like Angela Davis, obviously. I can't, you know, I just can't express how much her mentorship has been critical for my own healing and my own ability to stay in this process.
I love that. You know, we learn so much from the people whose shoulders we stand on. We learn so much from the ancestors, and I do feel as though once again they were holding you when you were writing this book, right? I felt it. It's all right there on the pages. And speaking of the pages, and before we jump into Q&A from the audience, I have one question to ask, because you ended the book in a way that I loved. I absolutely loved two things about the ending of this book. First of all, the last chapter of the book is fight the US state rather than make it stronger. That's very powerful sentiment. We'll get to it in a second. And then the second thing you do is at the end of that chapter, you basically tell readers, here you go, right? Like, start your journey.
Start yours, yes.
Exactly. So can you speak to the importance of that last chapter, why you sent readers off that way specifically, and why fighting the US state is so important, so much so that you ended the book on that last thought and note?
Yeah. Yes. I believe that in order for us to have a world where we can have our full dignity, our full humanity, be cared for, we have to get rid of the current one that exists. This system of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, it does not work. And we've seen it over and over again. We've seen the impact. And so building a new system is going to take all of us to join. We're all going to have to imagine this new system. And when I say that we need to challenge the US state, we need to challenge the US state. We have to challenge the ways in which it has been allowed to grow and harm so many people, both domestically and abroad. And so this conversation around challenging the US state feels like an important one. And it feels like a courageous conversation we have to have with ourselves, right? Because it challenges the notion of patriotism, it challenges the notion of, you know, having to stand up for this system. I want to stand up for humanity. I want to stand up for healing and for justice and for dignity. And if the country that I live in does not stand by those things, then I want to change that country. And I want to encourage all of us to do the same.
You know, that's such a powerful sentiment. And I think a lot of people don't understand the place that the United States holds in not just the systems here on this stolen land, but globally, right? I you know, and you do such a good job of kind of weaving in some of the statistics of where the military bases are and where the money's going, and along with your personal narrative. And when I thought about the book, again, when I just kind of like pontificated on it, if you would, be using my big words tonight, you know, I recognize that there was a lot of trauma in the pages. I think that all of us as just Black people in America, quite frankly, are suffering through trauma, even if we don't realize it. But then something came to me, actually, a friend asked me, a friend who like just loves you, asked me to ask you something, and it kind of reminded me of that idea of this trauma. How does joy inform the work of abolition? Because what was also in here was, quite frankly, a ton of joy. So how does that inform the work of abolition, and how does that inform Patrisse?
I mean, the thing that you asked me earlier at the start of this, like, who am I? Like, who's a human being? I'm very goofy, and I love laughing. And so joy is like a centerpiece of my existence, both for myself and for others. And joy is so critical for, I think, the path to our liberation as well. Joy and thriving, not just surviving. I, often am like, what funny Black TV show can I watch so I can just like crack up and laugh? I'm a big fan of South Side. Everybody should check it out. Oh my God. It's amazing. Exactly. It is. I cannot wait for season 3. It's just, that's like my humor. Like, so yeah, that's central. Joy is central.
Okay, so I want to stick on this for a second, because I think that this is some of the Patrisse that I just was so happy to find in this book. So I want to stay with joy for a moment, right? And just as an author and as an abolitionist, when you were working on this book, what were you listening to? Right? Like, give me some songs, give me some shows, give me something. I want to know, because you also have an MFA, and I don't know if everyone realizes that I learned that, in reading this book. So I know you're an artist. So I need some art right now.
Yeah, what was I doing? What was I listening to? I feel like I was definitely making my own art during this time. I was making a lot of my own art when I started writing this book. I was, listening to a lot of folks in the abolitionist world, like many of the people that I highlighted. I was like listening to their speeches, like Philip Agnew, Adrienne Maree Brown. I was reading Mia Mingus's work a lot, reading Ruth Gilmore's work a lot, watching Angela in her early days talk about abolition and incarceration. I was watching a pandemic and unfold, and like watching the medical industrial complex be a hot mess and not being able to really take care of people. Like, I was really knee deep in that.
So, it's interesting, because when you mention some of the things you've mentioned, you mentioned multiple abolitionists, you mentioned some of the speeches and just things that were informing your work and informing you. It reminded me of something, because I was informed by this book, right? Like, I actually am in the process of working on another book right now, and I was just like, okay, this work helped inform my work, and in that I was like, what does progress look like, right? Like, because like for me, I was like, that's actually progress for me. Just having this book, reading this book, it's all blurred out. Reading this book on an airplane as a Black man in 2022, a Black woman who wrote about abolition and informing my work, so that I can help young people also take up arms in abolition movements. Yeah. But how much do you think that we progressed in the last few years, few decades? What is your sense of that, right? Is this the progress, or some of it, not the totality, but is this some of the progress that you're looking for? Because there was a point where even the word abolition, we're on here right now for the New York Public Library. That's big, right? It's not small for what you're talking about, but what is your sense of it?
I feel like I haven't lived long enough to know, understand the true progress, because as you talked about earlier, I was on with Angela, last Thursday it was, and she's like, whoa, I never thought that abolition would be so talked about and it would be seen in this way, and that would reach so many people. And I'm like, God, we have such a long way to go. Like, but if I take just the time that I've been alive, And the work that I've done alongside many others, especially here in Los Angeles, I will say that 12 years ago, we were being laughed at talking at abolition. That when we brought it up in meetings with elected officials, it was like a taboo word. And I just read a press advisory for one of my local organizations that I work with, where we are working with the county, one of the county board of supervisors, and we've created these geometric domes that have gardens, autonomous gardens, that have about 500 to 1,000 vegetables that grow in them. And we're constructing them in places that are food deserts. And so we have one right now that will be launching soon in a food desert. And the pod is called an abolitionist pod. And the media advisory is being drafted by the county board of supervisors and one of the supervisors, and they have to say abolitionist pod. And I was like, I never thought I'd see the county use the term abolition, let alone work alongside us. But this is really powerful because it does mean that things are shifting, we are moving, and it sometimes may feel slow. And then one day you wake up and then you're like, oh my God, we're using this term and we're trying to grapple with it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being in college and many people I went to school with had never heard of Angela Davis, right? And I had a friend in college who hadn't heard of Angela's work recently asked me if I had seen you in conversation with Angela Davis. I'm like, well, first of all, you're new to this. But it showed me just how much, again, has changed. It's a long road. We have a lot more to go, but that's something. But anyway, so we have a question that I want to get to. It's a phenomenal question from one of the viewers. What role, if any, do you see for the faith-based community in abolition work? Do you see examples of abolition work being carried out in faith-based communities?
I love this question because I literally have like the person who is leading this work right now. Her name is Nikia Robert, and she is a pastor, and she started what's called Abolitionist Sanctuary. And it's a national faith-based coalition united against the moral crisis, a mass incarceration, and the criminalization of impoverished Black motherhood. And she is doing amazing work. I put it in the chat. So hopefully someone who's managing this event can send it over. Yes, there is a huge, I think the word huge is a little bit hyperbolic. There is a strong and powerful growing movement of faith-based leaders that are looking at abolition as a moral crisis. And Nikia is doing it in a way that is so powerful, so amazing, so incredible. And I love the work that she's doing. And I would say, please follow her work.
I love that. So another question, can you speak more on the tenderness mentioned at the beginning of this conversation and how that experience shows up in the intersection of Black queer femmes? I love that question. That's phenomenal. I wish I asked that.
I love that question. Yeah, that's such an incredible question. I think that abolition really does require us to show up in our most tender and vulnerable places. But with that, especially as someone who does that and who often leads with that, it also means that we have to, the one principle that's missing here is protection, the principle of protection. I didn't add that here, that I wasn't thinking about that, but given the massive attacks that I've been under, it's a new question I've been thinking about. We often require Black folks, especially Black queer femmes, to show up in our most vulnerable, authentic, tender selves as a way to help the rest of humanity show up for themselves and change the culture. And yet we are often unprotected. And so I believe that abolition, obviously it's not about bullying, but we do have to stand up for ourselves. We do have to ask others to protect us as well. And I feel like that intersection, if I were to add another step, I would add the step of protecting our communities because we deserve protection.
I love that. And, you know, that speaks to this idea of having, you know, these conversations that are deeply courageous. And that's what I'm trying to do in my work, right? I think that a ton of us as Black people and just marginalized people who are trying to create progress are trying to push people towards those types of conversations. And you just mentioned something that's deeply important to me, this idea of protecting, and that other communities who aren't in your own community, we need those communities, right? Like I, as a cishet Black man, need to support Black queer femmes, right? Like I, as a cishet Black man, need to support Black trans women and just all these different groups. Can you speak more to where you are finding tenderness in spaces or in people who aren't directly necessarily in your immediate community, but like you're finding it from those people?
Yeah. There's a lot of folks who've shown up over the last year, people that I don't even know, that have said, like, that have reminded me who I am, that have like really encouraged me, who've shown me a lot of care. That goes a long way for me. The care that people show, people that are outside of my community after after last summer when the quarantine was lifted. Here in Los Angeles, I went to an event in Leimert Park, one of like the historically Black communities. I was doing a Juneteenth event, and I remember how scared I was to go outside because of quarantine, and also because I had just been under severe attacks. And let me tell you how much I was loved on by Black people. How many people came up to me and thanked me, loved on me, say, "We see you, sis. We love you, sis." Like it was. I don't want to talk about it too much because I'm gonna start crying, and I have way too much makeup on to be crying on the screen, but. It was amazing. It was amazing. And those are the moments that and thank you for reminding me of that, Fred. Thank you for reminding me of like, where I get that love from. But those were the moments that I feel like I need to keep remembering as I keep moving forward in this place.
Yeah, I love to hear that, because I think that, this brings us back, we're going to wrap up soon, but this brings us back to one of the first things that I asked you. And, one of the first things I just wanted to touch on was just like this idea of humanity, right? Because I don't think that people truly understand what it means to be in the work. Right. And that's because I'll be quite frank with you. I didn't understand until a few years ago. Right. Like you get thrust into certain things and all of a sudden your world changes and you're looking around and you're like, wait, that's not who I am. Wait, where did they? So it means a lot to me that I hear you are getting that love somewhere, because you put so much. And once again, I implore everyone to go out and get this book, because there is so much love for all of you in this book, right? And I mean that truly. I felt it. I felt as though this was the book that would have helped people in my family, people who have been incarcerated, people who have been downtrodden, people who have been attacked by the police, myself, right? Like I'm a victim of stop and frisk. I've been incarcerated and all these things. And I felt as though if more people felt this love, I might not have been through the things that I've been through. So thank you for that. Right. And I truly mean that.
Thank you, Fred.
No, and I deeply, deeply mean it, because like I don't think that people understand just how much positive energy kind of just jumps off of you, it just radiates from the second that we started talking, and thank you for holding on to that, because it's so important in everything that you do. So I guess what I want to leave us with this evening is asking you one of my favorite questions to ask anybody whenever I'm moderating, right? Where do you want to see your love poured into the most in the coming days, weeks? Like, where are you placing your love, right? Like, as I know it's in the book, I know it's in the community, but like, who immediately do you want to feel your love? Excuse me.
Well, that's such a good question. I'm going to say I want my love to be felt by people who've been most impacted by the police and prison state, folks who are languishing inside jails and prisons right now as we know it, people who have been impacted by the lack of mental health care in this country, especially Black people and Black women. And I want my love to fill people who are struggling a lot right now. I don't think we recognize truly the impact that the 4 years under a white supremacist, an actively white supremacist government did to our bodies, our mental health, and how much we have to heal from that. Especially many of us were in act mode for so long. And so I want to just like pour that into folks, pour that love into folks. And I think, abolitionists who've been talking about abolition for a long time, who have seen and felt, the real impact abolition can have on our communities and our loved ones. I want those folks to feel that as well.
Well, I feel it right now. And I felt it in this book once again. So I ask everyone to, blurry book, I ask everyone to pick this up, an Abolitionist Handbook. You will learn, you will grow, you will question yourself, you will be afraid, you will be startled to your core, and then you will find yourself again in the pages having the courage to do the work. Because this work isn't about Patrisse, this work isn't about me, this work is about all of us, right? And I think that, like you said, every single person who reads this book will understand that this is about you, right? This is about you. And if you have any sense of a world of less punitive justice, if you have any sense of a world in which Black and brown people, trans people, a world in which all people are liberated, all people are able to be themselves, all people feel safe in their bodies, it is in this book. It is in this book.
Thank you.
Thank you.